while we wait for just a few more minutes to see if anybody else is going to join us, got a little poll for everyone to take, which hopefully this will work, just to get a little bit of information about what sorts of things you're interested in, what you've done to your lawn, and what sorts of things you're interested in knowing more about. Okay, so we've had the poll up, and those of you who can answer, I know some of you are on phone, so you can't answer this, but just wanted to get an idea of where we are. It looks like it's pretty split on soil testing. Some of you haven't done it. Some of you have done it in the last 3 years, and some of you have done it a while ago. Looks like most of us have cool season turf. A lot of folks spring fertilize, a lot of folks fall fertilize. Got a lot of different grass heights, but most of us are in the 3 to 4 range, which is for cool season grass. That's where we want. Most people are having issues with weeds or bare spots, so we should be addressing all of those in the course of this morning. So let's kind of get started here. We're talking about spring lawn care. I'm Thomas Bowles. I'm the Agriculture Extension Agent here at Virginia Cooperative Extension, Prince William. So for those of you who don't know, Virginia Cooperative Extension is a partnership between Virginia Tech and Virginia State University. Our mission is to get unbiased research out to the public. And so here in Prince William County, we have parenting education, we have financial education, we have nutrition education, we have youth development through 4-H, and then we have natural resources, or environmental natural resources, which covers our master gardeners, our home horticulture, our horticulture hotline, and those sorts of things. So today we've got several resources for you. Our horticulture helpline is mastergardener@pwcgov.org. You can send questions, you can send pictures of weeds, disease problems you have with turf or other plants. The phone number is there as well, although it's probably quicker to get an answer in these COVID days if you email us. We have more turf-related information on the county website. We also have a YouTube channel where this video will be added to, but we also have other turf videos. We also have a Facebook page, VCE Master Gardeners of Prince William County. And another valuable resource comes to us from Virginia Tech. It's the Lawn Fertilization in Virginia publication, and the URL's there. We will be sending out an evaluation by email, which will help us respond to both our local funders and our state funders. And if you would like a copy of this resource page, just let us know and we'll be happy to email it to you. So unfortunately, Virginia is what's referred to as the transition zone, and it's this orange zone here on this map. It's the area in between everything. So we can grow lots of different types of grasses in Virginia. We just can't grow any of them really well. In the north, they can grow cool season grasses very, very well, get really nice lawns. In the south, they can get really nice warm season lawns. Here in Virginia, we have problems growing lawns. We have issues with disease. We have issues with temperature and season. And so we can get decent grass, but it's really hard to get really, really pristine looking grass. And so understanding that, you kind of have to temper your expectations. Most people said they had cool season lawn. A couple people said they didn't know. If your lawn looks like this in the middle of winter, then you have warm season grasses. Warm season grasses go dormant. Depending on what kind of warm season grass, typically they start going dormant in October. Most of the time they don't start greening up until late May or into June. Again, it depends a little bit on which species, whether it's Bermuda or Zoysia or Nimblewill. And the reason that's important is that cool season and warm season grasses, as their names might imply, have different growth patterns. And so if we look at cool season grasses, which most of the lawns in Northern Virginia are, there are two growth windows. One is late winter, early spring. The other is late summer into fall. These are the times when we want to do most of our management. Summer, there's not a lot of growth going on because of dormancy. In the winter, there's growth going on, but it's usually root growth. It's semi-dormancy because you typically have a lot of cloud cover. Typically, it's colder, and so the biological processes are slower. Warm season grasses like zoysia and Bermuda, they typically run late spring into early fall, and then after that, they go into a dormancy and they have that straw color that I showed you earlier. And so when we look at different management things, we have to divide up and think, is it cool season? Is it warm season? And that will tell us what we should do and when we should do it. And so we'll go through some of these and talk about those. And if you have questions, let us know. We're happy to answer that. One thing that everybody should do is measure their turf. Herbicides, fertilizers, they tend to be applied in rates by thousands of square feet. And so if you don't know how much turf you have, you could be under applying or over applying. If you're over applying, you're wasting money and you're hurting the environment. If you're under applying, especially when it comes to herbicides, you may not be getting the job done. Soil testing, we recommend soil testing every 3 years for heavy soils, which is typically what we have here in Prince William County. Some of the eastern parts of the county have sandy soils and they probably need to be soil tested more frequently, but we want to make sure that the pH is right. If the pH isn't right, then whatever nutrients we add, it's going to be difficult for the plants to take them up. And so typically we adjust pH using lime. Lime should only be applied if you have a soil test telling you that you need lime. And a soil test from a lab will tell you how much lime to add to raise the pH to where you need it to be given whatever you want to grow, whether it's turf or vegetables or trees, what have you. Keep in mind this is an annual maintenance. We have some people who have pHs in the 8s in parts of the county because they add lime every year. For grass, we'd like it to be somewhere in between 6.3 and about 6.7. The nice thing about lime is you can pretty much add it any time of year to adjust the pH. So if you've got a soil test that's telling you need to add lime, you can start doing that in the spring. Compost is another thing we typically can add most of the year. Compost, it doesn't matter if it's warm season or cool season. Compost is actually feeding the soil and feeding the microbes in the soil, and they in turn will take care of your turf. And so it doesn't really matter what season you apply it in as long as the ground isn't frozen. And we recommend applying at least a 1/4 inch of compost once a year. And that's a 1/4 inch of compost above the ground, not a 1/4 inch of compost above the grass. You don't want to bury the grass. The big thing that we run into in the spring, and most of the questions I get in the spring, have to do either with weeds or fertilizer. And fertilizer, for most of us, is not really what we want to be doing in the spring, despite what the lawn fertilizer companies may tell us on our commercials. So if you've got cool season grass, which again is fescue and bluegrass, we really want to be careful about that because over applying in the spring is going to lead to diseases in late spring and through the summer. If we have warm season grasses, we may want to fertilize in the spring, but we need to wait until after they've started to green up. If they're still dormant, adding fertilizer, all it's going to do is feed your weeds. For cool season grasses, we don't want to fertilize in the summer. Ideally, our grass should be dormant then. And again, you're spending most of your fertilizer on weeds and not really on the grass that you're trying to help. But again, warm season grasses, that's the perfect time. June to mid-August is ideal for warm season grasses. For cool season grasses, most of our fertilizer should be done in what we refer to as the sun time, September, October, and November. Those 3 months, we're packing on root mass, and that root mass helps us get through the winter, through the spring, and through the following summer. And so that's when we really want to focus on fertilizing. When you talk about how much fertilizer should I apply over the course of the year, kind of depends on your situation. Most of our warm season grasses don't need a lot of fertilizer. Typically, we're going to go in the low end, somewhere about a pound, pound and a half. With our cool season grasses, it kind of depends if they're in full sun or shade. Typically, somewhere between a pound and a half to maybe 2 pounds is what most people need. As I said, a lot of the things that we get calls about in the spring, rather, has to do with herbicide. And usually it actually starts in the winter and people are asking about pre-emergent herbicide. And most of our pre-emergents are there to stop annual grasses. The most effective way to stop our annual grasses and most of our annual weeds for that matter is to have thick, high-cut turf. If the turf is thinner though, a pre-emergent might be appropriate. But the best time to apply that is somewhere between when forsythia is in full bloom and when it reaches about 50% petal drop, which coincides also with our native dogwoods coming into full bloom. So we've passed that window. And so with pre-emergence, that means that if you haven't applied it already, you've missed that first flush of warm season annual grasses. A lot of pre-emergents need to be applied several times over the course of the season though, because crabgrass, for example, is going to continue to germinate into the fall if the weather conditions are correct. So you may not get all of it, but if you've got really bad, historically really bad problems with crabgrass and you've missed that window, you might want to think about it. The other thing with pre-emergents is that the more it rains, the less effective they are. And so that's something to keep in mind. A couple years ago, when we had all that rain in the spring and it practically rained all summer, we had a lot of crabgrass because any pre-emergent that got put down was quickly diluted and just wasn't affected. And so a lot of times if there's heavy rains in the spring, pre-emergent has to be reapplied more often. This time of year, we're mostly thinking about post-emergent herbicides, herbicides that are going to deal with those weeds that have already come up. It's important though to target your applications based on what weeds you have. There are some weeds that some of our products work really well on and some that they don't work very well at all. And with some of these, to get the effectiveness of that herbicide, it has to be applied at a certain time of year. And so we need to think about timing and we need to think about what is the most appropriate thing for a given weed. So it's really important that you identify your weeds. And that Master Gardener helpline address that I gave you earlier, if you don't know what weed you have, you can send us pictures. We'll be happy to identify those weeds and give you control recommendations. Insecticides, we're starting to get into the period, probably towards the end of the month, we'll start to see grubs in the upper layer of the soil. Generally speaking, June is really when we want to start scouting for them. If you're not familiar with grubs, grubs are beetle larvae. They spend most of their life cycle deep in the soil. Late May, June, they come up as mature grubs. They spend most of July as adults. And then in August, the eggs are laid and they start hatching out. And August is typically when we want to treat. We want to do that because they're small enough that our insecticides will work and they're high enough in the soil profile where we'll be able to actually affect them. So with insecticides, you really have to look and see if you actually have grubs and then wait until August to do anything about them. With fungicides, we don't really recommend those. They typically do more harm than good. There is one disease that we get, Pythium blight. It's very rare in Northern Virginia, but it's the only disease that we typically get that is fatal to plants. Most of our other diseases are really cosmetic, and if you give it time, the plants will grow out of that disease. Other things, maintenance things that we might think about, aeration. If you have warm season grass, late spring, early summer is a good time. If you have cool season grass, you can do it in the spring, but you have to be careful because if the ground's too wet, you're going to rip up your grass. So we typically recommend waiting until September. A lot of people ask about dethatching. Unless you're over fertilizing, you really probably aren't going to have a problem with thatch. What little thatch that we typically get in this area under moderate fertilization tends to get broken up by aeration. When it comes to seeding, I know a lot of people have bare spots this time of year and they want to throw down grass seed. Unfortunately, because of the disease pressure we have, while our mature grass can handle the disease pressure and just have cosmetic damage, new seedlings usually aren't strong enough. They don't have the root reserves to survive disease over the summer. And so a lot of times if you plant grass seed in the spring, you're going to end up having to reseed again in the fall. And so we recommend September to early October is the ideal seeding time, unless you're trying to control erosion. Now, there are ways to work around that. If you don't have a problem with clover in your yard, clover can be seeded in April. That's something you could do this time of year, but if you're trying to put grass down, you really want to avoid seeding this time of year because you're going to get a lot of loss over the summer to disease pressure. When it comes to warm season grasses, you can get seed for Bermuda grass and zoysia. It tends to be really expensive, and those varieties tend not to be the recommended varieties for growing in our area. They tend not to look quite as nice. Typically, with our warm season grasses, because they're spreading grasses, a lot of times they will self-heal themselves. So we recommend not doing that or using either plugs or sod to repair spots in the yard. Both warm season grasses and cool season grass, sod is an option. Typically with warm season grasses, late spring, early summer is the best time to sod. With cool season grasses, you can do that in the spring, and because it's got roots, because it's a more mature plant, spring sodded turf is going to survive much better over the summer. And so if you've got big bare spots and you want to repair those with grass, you can use sod to do that. Sod gives us a much wider window. Ideally though, we want to plant sod in September. A lot of times if we plant sod over the summer or in late spring, you're going to use a lot of water trying to keep it alive over the summer. So let's look a little bit about weeds that we would typically see this time of year. At the top, we've got annual bluegrass, which is sometimes referred to as POA. Annual bluegrass is a cool season annual, and a lot of times, let's see if I can get the, there's the cursor. You end up looking with grass with this little white stuff on top, and that's the seed head. This time of year, we're kind of a little bit late in the annual bluegrass season, but you still see quite a bit of it around. This is difficult to control because anything that kills annual bluegrass is going to kill our cool season grasses. There are a couple of things that you can do in the fall. You can use pre-emergent in the fall. Instead of controlling crabgrass, you'd be controlling the annual bluegrass. But if you use a pre-emergent in the fall, you can't overseed. Typically, when we talk about pre-emergence, these two are the ones we're trying to deal with: crabgrass and goosegrass. They're both annual warm season grasses. The easiest way to tell is that the difference between the two is that crabgrass tends to have this purple in the center. Goosegrass, as it matures, gets white in the center. Goosegrass also, as it matures, tends to have more spokes like a wagon wheel, whereas crabgrass just kind of sprawls. Again, high turf, thick turf will take care of all of these guys. Foxtail is another annual warm season grass. There are actually 3 foxtails that grow in our area. Giant foxtail is the one that we tend to see quite a bit later in the summer. It's the most, I guess it's the most flashy of the foxtails. But a lot of times if there's construction in the summertime and they need to cover bare soil, they're going to use a yellow or a green foxtail, which is a much smaller seed head and doesn't get quite as tall. But when it gets in the lawn, it gets kind of weedy. There are a couple of warm season grasses that are weeds in cool season grass, but can be turf. That would be Bermuda grass, which is sometimes called wiregrass. Bermuda grass has these long runners. Um, it also has underground rhizomes, so it's a very aggressive grass. This is a grass that if you have it in your yard, you want to fertilize minimally because you don't want to encourage it. Most of the time in Northern Virginia where we see Bermuda grass, it's in sports fields because it can recover so quickly from damage. A lot of times we don't want to see this in the lawn because it gets into the flower beds, it gets into the neighbor's lawn, and sometimes that doesn't make for good neighbor relations. Nimblewill is interesting. It's a shade-tolerant warm season grass, and it's a native Virginia grass, but it is considered a weed in most cases. It has an interesting growth pattern. It grows along the surface and grows up, and so a lot of times when you pull it up, it has this sort of shape to it, where the runner's on the ground and then it sprouts up. Um, Nimblewill seed is a little bit hard to find. Nimblewill, however, sometimes is your best option for the shady areas, especially if you have a lot of activity going there because you've got kids playing or dogs playing. It's a little hard to establish, but it is an option. Um, Bermuda grass and Nimblewill are really difficult to get out of the lawn once they've been established. And they'll take probably a couple seasons. If they're really well established, they'll probably take a couple seasons to get out of the yard completely. And so these two are weeds that you want to deal with as soon as you can once you see them in your yard. Plantains, relatively easy to get rid of. A lot of times you can pull these pretty easily, especially if the ground is a little bit damp. There are two types of plantains. This is the broadleaf plantain. There's a thinner leaf plantain, the buckthorn. They both pretty much treated the same. The one difficulty with them is that they have kind of a waxy coating on their leaves. And so sometimes that makes it a little bit harder for herbicides to absorb in them. Veronica or Speedwell, you see a lot of that in with little blue flowers this time of year. It's very low growing. You see it in driveway cracks. You see it in sidewalks. A lot of times if you've got turf that's maintained at a decent mowing height, you don't run into Veronica too much in the turf itself. It's usually more bare areas. Wild strawberry is similar, although I've seen wild strawberry infest lawns. It spreads by runners. It's really difficult to get rid of by herbicide. Most of the time you've got to dig it out. And so this is another weed where if you see it in your yard, you want to get rid of it as soon as possible. This time of year, we also see bittercress, which is a cool season weed, but this time of year, it's got little white flowers on it. And throughout most of the county at this point, it's developed these long little seed pods to it. Bittercress is annoying because if you brush up against a mature seed pod, it explodes and it sends seeds everywhere. The other annoying bit about bittercress is it goes from germination to mature seeds in a relatively quick fashion. And so a lot of times you'll get several generations of bittercress in one season. Chickweed is another one that we have problems with in the county quite a bit. Chickweed, most of the chickweed right now looks like this from a distance. It's kind of whitish and sort of yellowy because it's in late stage. A lot of the chickweed in the county has already flowered. The problem with both of these weeds is that using herbicides on them now isn't really going to do a whole lot because they're nearing the end of their life cycle, and whatever energy they have left, they're just going to put into seed development. And so a lot of times applying herbicide is just going to speed up their seed development, and they're going to die anyway. So this time of year, these two really, it's kind of on the fence as to whether it's really worth it if you want to apply an herbicide. Typically with both of these, you want to use herbicides much earlier in the spring before they flower to be really effective. Ground ivy is a perennial. This is one of those that a lot of people consider a weed. I actually like it because these nice purple flowers you get in the spring, they're good for pollinators. It's pretty low growing, so it's usually not that big of a deal. It doesn't stick out too much in the turf. This is a little bit difficult to get rid of. So again, this is another one of those weeds that if you don't like it, if you don't want it in the turf, you need to spot it early and treat it early. This time of year, we're also looking at these two guys quite a bit. This is henbit over here. It's got these little nest basket shapes. And then we've got dead nettle next to it. They're both annual mints. They both have these little pinkish purple flowers. They're both important for early pollinators. They're fairly easy to pull. Generally speaking, though, if you want to control these, you want to do it earlier in the spring before they flower so they don't set seed. But they're relatively easy to get rid of. In our area, we have a little bit of wild onion, and this is wild onion over here on the left. But most of the wild alliums we have are wild garlic. Wild garlic is round, wild onion is flat. Both of these are really resistant to herbicides, and typically the best way to get rid of them is to actually dig them up to make sure you get the bulb out of them. We're also seeing a lot of dandelion this time of year. We haven't quite hit the peak of dandelion flowering, but we've got a lot of dandelion that's come up, a little bit of flowering in the county. Dandelion is something that a lot of people don't like. I like it because it supports a variety of pollinators, but I also understand how ugly it can look when you've got all sorts of different heights of flowers. The other problem with dandelion is that dandelion seeds go a very long distance, and so if you've got one person on the block not treating for dandelions, you're going to have dandelions all summer. And sometimes it's better to live with it than to put down herbicide repeatedly over the summer trying to kill dandelions. We have 3 plants that look very similar. White clover, which is a legume. White clover actually adds nitrogen to the soil and reduces your fertilizer needs. A lookalike is this is wood sorrel, and there's a darker wood sorrel that's more of a purpley color. It's sometimes actually sold as an ornamental, oxalis. That's the genus name to it. It doesn't have the same benefits, although it is pollinator friendly. And then black medic, which is somewhat related to white clover, but we see that in the lawn as well. Typically, if we're going to have something in the lawn, we would prefer it be white clover because it's very symbiotic with grass. These other two don't grow at the same pace, and they don't have the same advantages that white clover have. All of these are fairly easy to get rid of. Wood sorrel is probably the most difficult. It's got some chemical resistance, but the other two tend to be easier to control with herbicides. These plants we haven't started to see quite yet, but we'll be seeing them soon. Lespedeza, as the summer gets going, Lespedeza will start getting woody. You can actually hand pull this. It's an annual. But a lot of times, if it's established in the yard, it's got a big, every year it's going to put out a lot of seeds, and so you'll have more and more every year unless you control it early. Sometimes we need to use herbicides depending on the population. It's important to realize that Lespedeza is difficult to control, and it's best controlled early in the summer. So this is one of those things that you want to be on the lookout for, and as soon as it starts to come up, that's when you want to treat for it. The same is true of this next one, spurge. Spurge, though, is typically, you're not going to see it in the lawn, you're going to see it next to the lawn, along the sidewalks, in the driveway, in bare ground, in your beds. Spurge is difficult to control as well, although if the ground is damp, a lot of times we can pull spurge. The one thing you have to be careful with about spurge is that it's got a milky sap. That milky sap, some people have an allergic reaction to. It's usually not poison ivy bad, but it can cause some skin irritation, so you need to be careful about that. It does have a long tap root. Most of the time, I usually wait for the ground to get a little bit damp, and then I twist it and pull it, and that seems to be the best way to get rid of spurge if you're hand pulling. And then the last one we have here is nutsedge. Nutsedge looks like a grass. It's a lot more yellow than our turf, but it's a sedge. It's related to grass, but not quite. And so there's a whole class of herbicides called sedgicides that are specifically designed to deal with these guys. The thing is that once you get 5 leaves on the plant, it becomes much more difficult to control. So this is another thing where you want to be, if you know you've got this, you want to be able to go out in the yard, take a look at what's going on, and when you start seeing it, you know, a little seedling like this is the ideal stage to treat this. When it gets bigger like this, where it's got all these leaves to it, it's a lot more difficult to control. A lot of times by the time it's got this stage, it's got several tubers down under the ground. If you try to pull them out, the tubers will snap off and stay in. If you hit it with herbicide, they may not kill those tubers, depending on what stage of development. So getting them early is the key to dealing with nutsedge. The other thing to think about when you're looking at herbicides, if you want to go herbicide, is think about what's actually in the product. And I'm using Roundup here as an example because Roundup, there are actually about 20 formulations. And so they all have different things in them. And some are better than others, depending on what you're trying to control and where you're trying to control it and when you're using it. So Roundup, the original Roundup was just glyphosate. And glyphosate has gotten knocked around a bit, but glyphosate is one of the better all-purpose herbicides we have. But you know, depending on what the recommendation is, you really need to read the label. Because, for example, if you've got a recommendation that you need to use glyphosate to kill a weed, you've got all these different sorts of formulations. This one doesn't have glyphosate, so it's, depending on what the weed is, it may not do anything. The Crabgrass Destroyer Roundup is really only effective on annual grasses. Some of these different formulations are more effective than others, but they also affect how soon you can go ahead and overseed. So something like glyphosate with triclopyr is very effective on a lot of hard to kill weeds, but it's got a long wait period between when you apply it and then when you can turn around and overseed. So you have to be really careful about using it in late summer. The extended control and the 365 max, these really aren't turf products. These are products that you use on your driveway, that you use in between pavers, those sorts of things, because they have such extended control that it makes it really difficult to apply this and then overseed in the fall. So be sure if you're using herbicides, you read the label to know what you're using, and also read the label to know what the safety precautions are. A lot of times we take for granted that they're over-the-counter herbicides, and we think of them as relatively safe, but remember they are poisons, and they're all going to have instructions on how to use them safely and what personal protective equipment you need to use these in a safe manner. The other thing to think about too is that sometimes when we're applying fertilizer, we're also applying chemicals, or excuse me, herbicides. And so you need to be mindful of that and mindful of what they're doing. You know, again, you probably want, if you've got cool season grass, you want to stay away from fertilizing in the spring. But if you're putting out a little bit of fertilizer in the spring and you're trying to throw weed control at the same time, keep in mind that a lot of times if you're putting enough herbicide out to actually be effective, you may be over fertilizing, and vice versa. If you've got warm season grass, some of these products are pretty good for late spring, but for cool season grass, probably not a good idea. And if you've got leftover from the spring and you decide that you're going to use it in the fall, you need to be careful as well. This step 1 product, for example, has a pre-emergent in it. And so if you fertilize with this and then overseed, that pre-emergent is going to stop that overseeded grass from germinating. So you need to be careful. And that's one of the reasons why we recommend that if you're going to fertilize, fertilize. If you're going to do weed control, do weed control. Try and keep it separately. So let's see what questions we have. We can open this up. Nancy, do we have any questions?
Not yet. Well, we had one about moss, an area that has moss and maybe some alternate ground covers for that. You'll cover that though, I think.
I hadn't planned on it, but I can. So moss is actually an excellent alternative ground cover. One of the problems we have with turf is that turf doesn't grow very well in shade. Even our shade tolerant turf really doesn't like shade. Typically, if you've got less than 6 hours of sun in an area, turf is not going to be a good alternative. And really less than 8 hours, you're going to be fighting it. Moss is typically found in heavy shade or places where the soil's really acidic or really wet. It's a great low maintenance ground cover because it doesn't need to be fertilized, it doesn't need to be mowed. The big downside with moss is that it has really poor wear resistance. So if you have kids or dogs that are going to be running around on the moss, they're going to rip it up. And so it may not be the best choice. There are lots of alternative ground covers. The ground ivy I showed earlier as a weed is an excellent ground cover in shady spots. We have a whole list of alternative ground covers. If folks are interested, just let us know and we'd be happy to send that out.
I'll put the email in the chat box and you can email us and we'll send you a list of alternate ground covers.
Yeah, and I wasn't expecting a whole lot of people to want alternative ground covers, so I didn't include that in this presentation. But there really are a lot of different textures and colors you can add to your yard. The biggest downside, well, two big downsides to ground covers is that typically with ground covers, they're not available as seed. So you have to buy plant starts or plugs, which makes it a little bit more expensive to convert an area into ground covers. The flip side, though, is that once they're established, you tend not to have to fertilize them. And so in the long run, you may actually be saving money that way. The other downside about ground covers is that most of them aren't very wear resistant, not as bad as moss. Moss is probably the least tolerant of foot traffic, of heavy foot traffic. But a lot of our ground covers can't handle that kind of foot traffic. So again, if you've got dogs, if you've got kids, they're going to be playing on that. That's going to be a problem. So let's open it up. If anybody's got any questions, we've got.
There's a question about compost.
For whatever reason, I'm not able to actually see the chat. Can you read the question?
What kind of compost do you recommend?
So when we're adding compost, we're doing it to add carbon to feed the microbes. So really, it doesn't matter. I know a lot of people who will go and spend the money on leaf grow, which is kind of expensive. But when it comes down to it, save the expensive, high quality compost for your vegetables, for your ornamentals. With turf, you're just adding it for carbon, and so any kind of compost will work. The county, for example, has bulk compost that they sell at Ballsford and at the landfill. That's good enough because again, it's more about feeding the microbes than it is necessarily feeding the plants.
Okay, here's a question about, they pulled up Bermuda grass. Let me look at it again. I pulled up Bermuda grass and then resodded. How do they keep the Bermuda from coming back?
You cannot.
Yeah. Our weed specialist for the state often says that you never fully control Bermuda grass. You really have to stay on it and scout for it. And when it comes up, pull it. Bermuda grass, and it also depends on how established that Bermuda grass is before it was treated. There was a golf course in Richmond. I tell the story quite a bit. Several years ago, they decided for whatever reason, they were going to replace their Bermuda grass greens with cool season grass. And they stopped digging at 6 feet, still finding Bermuda grass roots. And this was a golf course that had had Bermuda grass probably for 50 years. Typically, you don't find roots that deep in a lawn situation, because most lawns don't have Bermuda grass that's that old. But Bermuda grass is one of those things that is really difficult to fully eradicate, and you just have to stay on it. Especially if you've got it coming over from a neighbor, or you've got one area where you knew that there was a problem before you killed it. Chances are it's going to come back, and so for at least a couple seasons, you have to be monitoring that area. The other thing with Bermuda is that Bermuda is one of those grasses that the rhizomes in the soil, if you don't get all of it, it can resprout from that. And that's what makes Bermuda so difficult to control. Hand pulling works, as it comes up through the sod, doing some quick hand pulling will work. You can also spot treat it with glyphosate, although you got to be careful not to overspray and kill too much of the cool season turf. Those are probably your best options, but it's about scouting and making sure that as it comes up, you get it while it's small, so it has the least amount of time capturing more sunlight and improving those roots.
How long between core aeration and composting? Scott wants to know.
As long as it takes you to get the compost in the wheelbarrow and out on to the lawn. So basically, when you're core aerating, you're pulling up plugs, and you're creating these voids in the soil, and so eventually those voids are going to fill back up. So getting a compost in before those voids have a chance to fill back up allows you to get compost deeper in the soil profile. So you can do it, if depending on how big your yard is and depending on how hard it was to get through the aerating, you can do it that same day, you can do it that same weekend, within a couple weeks. Well, if there are no more questions, then I would invite you to join us again next Wednesday, where Nancy will be talking about invasive plants. Also, again, check out our YouTube channel, VCE-Prince William. We do have several turf videos there, including the extended class of our 12 Steps to a Greener Lawn program, which goes in detail about different types of management strategies. It also has a little bit more on ground cover alternatives. Also, if you think of questions or have questions as we go through the season, again, contact the Master Gardener helpline, and we're happy to answer those questions. If you have questions about soil tests, let us know. We can send out soil test kits. Once you get your soil tests back, we can help interpret those for you if you need that as well. If you enjoyed this program, please let us know. If you have suggestions for other classes you'd like to see, please let us know. Again, this is the Horticulture Help Desk email. We also have information at pwcgov.org/grow. That is on the county website. It has more information on upcoming classes. Thank you all for participating, and hopefully we'll see you again next time. We were planning on having these weekly classes through the summer, especially since we're not able to meet in person over the summer. And like I said, if you have ideas for things that you want to see, please let us know. We're trying to be as responsive as we can be given the COVID situation. Thank you all for coming, and have a good rest of your day.